Alright man, you already know what time it is. Can't believe that I didn't get to this one sooner. We got the patron request from Siege Hart. He says, how about explaining how servants can summon servants, like Medea summoning Sasaki Kojiro? Fire question. By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your requests, the ability for servants to summon other servants, and also one of the greatest wild cards out of Fate Stay Night in general. We first see this from Medea, which is a complete game changer for the way that the story has to play out. As a matter of fact, a lot of circumstances literally revolve around her bringing Sasaki into the situation, like him going against Saber for instance. It's a really big deal. Granted, this isn't the only time that we've seen this happen. We've seen this happen a number of times through the verse before, even after the fact. Instances like Jalter summoning servants in Orleans, or even Gilgamesh summoning servants in Babylonia, just to name a few. But since Medea is the OG of the matter, since she started it all, we're gonna lead into this first with what she was able to accomplish. So going into the Fate materials, there's actually a question that's directly about this. They asked Nasu, after Medea summoned Sasaki, was she branded with command spells? I asked because I don't think she ever used a command spell on him. And Nasu says she had something similar to a command spell, though as a fake master with a fake servant, it wasn't something as powerful as the real one. While she may not originally have had command spells, she was able to skillfully borrow power from the Greater Grail itself and make her own imitation. Considering what we have so far, there's a couple of things that we learned from this. One, that you don't even have to have real command spells to pull this off. And if you're great enough as a servant, you can just make your own. Didn't have to be Medea, she just happened to be the one that was caster in this situation. Another thing is that you don't have to be a caster. As I mentioned, Jalter was able to pull the same thing off in Orleans. She was a ruler in that chapter. But even considering the fact, she was able to summon not only one, but multiple of her own to lead out against us in battle. She summoned Daon, Vlad, Atalanta, Martha, Carmilla, Lancelot, and Charles Sanson. And as far as we know, they didn't have any deficiencies. The only deficiency that they had was Berserker enhancements, which is something that she placed on them herself for extra power. They didn't have to have that. It's the same way how Zokin manipulated Lancelot's summoning. He originally wasn't going to be a Berserker, and then Zokin forced that madness on him. If you look at Babylonia, Gilgamesh, even as a living servant, was able to summon multiple servants of his own. He summoned Ushi, Benkei, Leonidas, Merlin, and then you have the ones that were defeated before we even got there, which was Tomoe, Amakusa, Ibaraki, and Fuma. He had a fire lineup. If we look at the situation with Gil, he didn't have to create any imitation spells, and he also didn't have to be in any extra class to do it. The difference with him is that he was a caster, like Medea's circumstance, and he does have potential for being Grandcaster. So again, if anybody was able to accomplish this, he will be one of the leading positions. If we look at all three of these as a whole, the only consistent thing is the mana pool. It's not the class, it's not the age of the servant, because we know that Medea and Gil are both from the age of gods. You would expect this out of them, but then you have Jalter do it in the first chapter, and it shows us that it's not just restricted to older servants either. Something that you do notice in common here is them borrowing powers from the Grail, because we do know that Jalter had a Grail. It was a part of her as Jill's creation. You have Nasu's claim. He tells us that Medea borrowed from the Greater Grail, and then Gil also had an actual Grail in his possession. And I would go as far to say that it isn't even necessarily the Grail. I know they frame it that way, but when you crunch it down, it's the ability to have that much influence while they're being summoned, because we have plenty of casters in Fate in general. We got a big roster, and not everybody can summon other servants, even outside of that class. Every time we see it, they have some type of access to a large pool of mana, whether that be through the Grail or some type of manipulation of their own accord. We don't know exactly how Medea got in contact with the Greater Grail, because she did it off screen, but I'm willing to bet that she did it with Rule Breaker. So really all you would need is something to simulate that, something that's at least Rule Breaker level, and you can come up with the same effect. Heck, like I said with Gil and Jalter, they had the Grail, but we know Medea was pulling mana to Ryodo Temple from the city to reinforce her workshop. So off screen, she had a vast pool of mana before it even started. And I feel like that's the way that she was really able to summon them. And since the mana was coming from Ryodo Temple itself, she was forced to use the gate as a catalyst, and that's why he's restricted to that very region. Though Sasaki was extremely powerful and equipped, he couldn't leave Ryodo Temple. So that's one drawback of not physically having the Grail in your possession. In that case, we see that it's different. Another thing that we know is that the master directly influences how that servant is going to come out when they get summoned to begin with. So for instance, when you consider Jalter summoning somebody versus Gil summoning the same person, it's highly likely that the servant is going to be more equipped under Gil because he just has better parameters altogether. The only case where I could see otherwise is if she has some type of affinity to that servant. So let's say she summons somebody French. She'll probably have him up on that because she's actually from France. So looking at these patterns, how they're able to summon them, we know that the class doesn't matter, the age doesn't matter, and as far as the Grail goes, it's just a roundabout way of saying that they have the mana pool to pull it off. Now, I will say that you have to want to summon another servant. Just because you have a large mana pool doesn't mean that you're gonna auto summon servants, but you have to want to do that as well. And as far as we can see, it'll give you whatever is in capacity. Now, in the case of Jalter and Gil, those circumstances were from FGO. So that's a lot different from a standard Grail war like Medea was in. Medea was constricted, that's why she had to make the fakes, and that's also part of the reason why Sasaki wasn't a real servant. He was just a wraith. Because realistically, she's in Japan, she could have summoned anybody, but she specifically chose Sasaki, likely because it would be easier to pull off. That's less stress on her. If it was only about borrowing powers from the Grail, then Medea could have summoned multiple servants herself on the same level as Jalter. She's a greater mage anyway, and she was already breaking the rules. But since it was a standard Grail war, since her mana pool was restricted to that what was inside Ryodo Temple, she could only do one, and a natural choice was Sasaki. And ironically, and this just shows how apt she is as a servant, Medea had more authority over Sasaki than Atrum had over her when she was summoned. Remember, when Atrum summoned her, she killed him, and he could do nothing about it. Yet you have Sasaki in UB-Dub when she told Sasaki she was about to raid the church, and he said, "Do you think Kazuki would be cool with that?" Medea was like, "Did I ask if Kazuki would be cool with that?" And then she blew his entire chest open. Literally blew his chest open. Even Atrum couldn't get that far, and she had that type of authority even as a fake master. It's crazy. By the way, Medea is on that long list of servants that got done bad that I was just talking about. And yet another reason why she needs more time in the sun. One of her greatest feats is her summoning another servant. It's her having another dude. She's the whole reason that Sasaki even exists in Stay Night. Still can't get the credit. What a shame.